They say that you know within the first few seconds of looking into another person's eyes whether there's going to be chemistry between you or not. But what does that actually mean, to have chemistry with someone? Does that mean that there's some sort of a natural process at work that is more powerful than any rational thought at all? And if that's the case, is this what the basis of love is? And if it is, does that justify anything? Can you do anything you want in order to bring that love to fruition, to realize it? What if you're already in a relationship? What if you're married, say? And anyway, how do you really know that there is this chemistry? And what are you going to do about it? Does it set aside all morality? If it does, where does that leave freedom? What does it mean to have chemistry with someone? My name's John Noyes, and I'm here to guide you through the reading of all of Goethe's novels. And today we're going to look at Elective Affinities. Last week we saw how Goethe went to great lengths to make it clear to the reader that the story of Wilhelm's development, his Bildung, is embedded in a whole series of other stories, of representations, of signs, and making very subtle use of irony. Goethe draws our attention to the problem every step of the way that Wilhelm had of trying to interpret his situation, trying to step outside of his situation, trying to inhabit what could be called a higher level of mind in order to understand the limited perspectives of his situation. Now he's going to continue that same strategy in his next novel, Elective Affinities, Die Wahlverwandtschaften, but this time he's going to give it a different slant. He's going to bring in the claims of scientific discourse to objectivity and truth, and he's going to juxtapose that to the issues that he was exploring around representation and interpretation, and above all, desire, these issues that he was exploring in Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship. In Wilhelm Meister, Goethe led us slowly into the ironic state of the narration. But in Elective Affinities, he's going to tell us from the very first sentence that there is a distance between the voice of the narrator and the actions that are being narrated. Listen to how he starts it. He says, Edward, as we shall call a well-to-do baron in the prime of his life, Edward had been spending the finest hours of an April afternoon, and so on. This we, which more or less arbitrarily decides to call the main character Edward, even though, as we're going to learn later on, his name is Otto, and so the naming Edward is not arbitrary at all, because it's part of the central jest of the novel. But this we is by now, I think, a familiar voice for us, because in the course of Wilhelm Meister, we saw the we appearing again and again, and, as I said last week, reaching his hand into the puppet theater in order to spoil the illusion. And when it comes to the writing of Wilhelm Meister's journeyman years, then something similar is going to happen at the very beginning. We start reading that novel, and we read, Chapter 1, Overshadowed by a mighty cliff, Wilhelm was sitting at a fearsome, significant spot where the precipitous mountain path turned a corner and began a swift descent. An ironic beginning, a narrator? No, but look at the subtitle, look at the heading that he gives this. He calls it The Flight into Egypt. So this direct quote from a scene in the Bible tells us again the narrator is playing a game with us. Goethe's novel was published in 1809, Die Wahlverwandtschaften, Elective Affinities, but he'd been working on it for a couple of years. He first got the idea in 1807, it seems, when he was starting work on Wilhelm Meister's journeyman years. He was working on a continuation of the apprenticeship. And this continuation, we're going to see this, is interspersed with a number of novellas, short prose, which apparently doesn't have very much to do with the main plot itself, but maybe does have quite a lot to do with it. And this story of Edward and Ottilia and Charlotte and the captain was going to be another novella which was inserted into the journeyman years. But the material expanded beyond that framework, and it became a novel in its own right, what Goethe was later going to call his best novel. So when Goethe starts work on the Elective Affinities, he's not actually in Weimar. First he's in Jena, and then he's in Karlsbad. And like in the writing of the apprenticeship, the political situation around Jena, Weimar, Karlsbad at this time is overshadowed by war. And this time it's not the French Revolution, it's the Napoleonic Wars. In October 1806, the battles of Jena and Auerstedt had been won by Napoleon, basically fought on the doorstep of Weimar. And these battles had put an end to the Holy Roman Empire. This political framework for basically all of Goethe's writings so far was now over. And the Napoleonic Wars were going to continue, and they were going to form the political context for the writing of this novel. Now, why is that important? For a couple of reasons. First of all, the political aftermath of the French Revolution, I mentioned this, had caused a great deal of doubt in the minds of Goethe and Schiller concerning the inherent natural goodness of the human being, which just needed to be tended like a plant, and it would on its own accord sprout and blossom. Instead, there was a need for some kind of political guidance. And this kind of political guidance was intimately connected to the idea of Bildung, because Bildung was bringing out what's best in a character, not what's natural or spontaneous in a character, but what's best in a character. And Schiller had put this very clearly in his letters on the aesthetic education, where he had said, and I'm going to just loosely paraphrase, he said that every improvement in the political realm should come from a process of making the individual's character more noble, of purifying it. And how is it possible for a character to be purified and made more noble if a state constitution is barbaric? And Schiller is glancing over at France. And so he says, for this purpose, we would have to create tools. We would have to create a special means of forming the foundation for the purification and making noble of the character. And Schiller says the state is not going to do that, so we have to do it, we artists, because he states explicitly the tools that we need for purifying a character and making the character more noble are going to come from art. And it's important to see this dimension of art in the concept of Bildung that Goethe works with. We also saw when we were talking about Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship that Goethe had taken part in the campaign against post-revolutionary France in 1793. Later on, he was going to start stylizing this campaign as a campaign of reason against the affects. So Goethe is thinking about this tension between reason and the affects, and we're going to see that carrying forward in the Elective Affinities. And then one final comment in this direction. Goethe remained his lifelong dedicated to cosmopolitanism, Weltbürgertum, world citizenship. But what he saw happening politically around the time that he was writing Elective Affinities was an increasing commitment to nationalism. And Goethe disliked this commitment to nationalism. He thought it was dangerous. So he's still in pursuit of essential human qualities that can be used as the foundation for a political change which is going to be beneficial to all humanity. It's kind of tempting when we read Goethe's novels to keep this political context out of them, because they don't seem to point to it that directly. But if we read his letters and his diaries and his notes around the time he was writing Elective Affinity, we can see that he was deeply affected by the conditions of the war. For example, he wrote about how his work was interrupted by all the events to do with the wars. He talks about how the forceful advances of the French in Austria had caused great fear, and the King of Westphalia had made moves against Bohemia. I'm paraphrasing from his notebooks now. And for this reason, Goethe says, I went back to Weimar in June. This is June 1808. And then already on the 15th of July, the King of Westphalia comes to Weimar, Goethe writes, and it looks like he's basically just running away from the enemy. So Goethe leaves Weimar and goes to Jena, and then the next thing he notes is that the Wahlverwandtschaften were given to the printers around this time. Now there's another contextualization which I think is useful when we're reading this novel, and that's the biographical one. It's often tempting to speak of an author's love life when we read their books and their poems, their plays, their novels. But in this case, I think it's worth pointing out that Goethe, when he returned from Italy, he met a young woman who was working at the artificial flower factory in Weimar. Her name was Christiane Vulpius, and he brought her to live with him. They were partners, but they didn't get married. And this was a kind of a double scandal in Weimar society. First of all, because of the difference in class, but also because of the fact that they lived together as man and wife, not married. Now there's a story about how when Napoleon's troops were kind of marauding in Weimar and Jena after the Battle of Auerstedt, Christiane behaved very, very bravely in a manner that helped both of them through this period. And as a reward, if you can put it like that, Goethe got married to her. Because she used to have to withdraw whenever his noble and well-respected visitors used to come. And I'm reading from the introduction to this version of Elective Affinities, the Oxford Classics, translated by David Constantine. And he says, Christiane, as Goethe's mistress and because of her class, was not presentable. She withdrew when guests came. But in Goethe's published correspondence with her, the tone on both sides is warmly and ordinarily human. And she got married to him on the 19th of October 1806 and bore him his son August. And Goethe, so Constantine says, didn't think that this official sanction in itself was important. She was always my wife, he used to say. But after they got married, at least Christiane could be taken out and introduced as his wife. And Constantine then goes on to say, it is worth mentioning Christiane Vulpius in this context, since Elective Affinities obviously has to do with marriage. Goethe lived with her for 18 years before they married, and though his relationship with her was not only the longest lasting, but also the fullest in his life, still he never felt obliged to forsake all others on her account, and between 1788 and 1816 was in love elsewhere, more or less passionately, more or less intimately, half a dozen times at least. So it's pretty clear. Goethe is thinking about marriage, what is socially sanctioned, what is morally correct, what is defensible. He's thinking about the urges of desire and how far you're going to follow them, how much you're going to allow them to be curtailed simply on the basis of what is socially acceptable. And so he starts thinking about this question, what is it that actually drives human action? What drives two people to come together and stay together? And what pushes them apart again? And here he begins to think of a chemical analogy. he had read, at least by the 1790s, he had read a scientific study by a Swedish chemist by the name of Torbjörn Bergman, who in 1775 had written a study called De Attractionibus Electivus, on elective attractions, on elective affinities. And it had been translated into German in 1782 with the title Die Wahlverwandtschaften. And in chapter 4 of book 1, we are going to see Bergman's ideas unfolded. So let's take a quick look at that pivotal chapter in the book, the key chapter. And when I say key, I mean it's the key which promises to unlock the mystery of the book. But as we read on, we're going to find that the key does not unlock the mystery. The key simply deepens and compounds the mystery. So on page 116 of volume 11 of our collective works, we're going to read a very short symbolization of Bergman's concept. The captain is speaking, and he says, if you don't think it's pedantic, I'll be happy to use symbols for the sake of brevity. Think of a substance A existing as a compound with substance B, unable to be sundered from B by force or any other means. And then think of a substance C related in the same way to substance D. Now bring the two compounds together. A will combine with D and C with B in such a way that it will be impossible to say which elements separated or recombined first. And Edward immediately chimes in and interprets this chemical process as a matter that can be used to describe human behavior. And he says, well now, until we can see these things with our own eyes, let us regard these formulae as metaphors and derive from them a lesson for our immediate use. You, Charlotta, are A, and I am your B, for in reality I depend on you alone and stay by you, as A always stays with B. C is clearly the captain, who at the moment is pulling me away from you somewhat. Now, if you don't want to end up floating around in the air, we will have to procure a D for you, and that, without a doubt, is our charming young Ottilia, to whose arrival you can really no longer raise any objection. Now, this scene is shot through and through with a wicked irony, and it's worthwhile reading it very carefully. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. When the captain explains the analogy to Charlotte, he says that A will combine with D and C with B in such a way that it will be impossible to say which elements separated or recombined first. And when we read on and we get to chapter 12, that very first embrace between Edward and Ottilia, look at the way it's described. Ottilia comes into the room. I'm on page 149. Ottilia said nothing, but she gazed into his eyes with the greatest of content. Edward held out his arms. You love me, he cried. Ottilia, you love me. And they clasped each other in their arms. Who caught hold of the other first? No one could have made out. Edward cries out, you love me, right after Ottilia has shown him the manuscript that she copied, and he notices as the writing progresses, the handwriting gradually transforms from Ottilia's into Edward's handwriting. He looks at it and he says, for heaven's sake, what is this? That is my own handwriting. He looked at Ottilia and then back at the pages. The end especially was as if he had written it himself. And that's when he calls out, Ottilia, you love me. Now we go back to the original, the chapter where they're talking about the chemical principle. And when they first mention it, Charlotte hears the captain and Edward talking, and she says, my attention came back to your reading and I realized that you were talking of inanimate objects, so I took a look at the page to reorient myself. And Edward says, it's a figure of speech that's distracted and confused you. The book is dealing with minerals and different types of earth, but man is a real Narcissus. So, Charlotte hears the chemical principle. She thinks of herself. Edward says, you're a real Narcissus. But who's the Narcissus in this novel? It's not Charlotte, it's Edward. Everything that happens, he relates back to himself. And then the final example of wicked irony when it comes to the symbolization of the process, and Edward's lovely explanation where he says, let's take this metaphor and apply it to ourselves in order to learn something. He, of course, gets it completely wrong. A and B are Charlotte, but C, that A is going to combine with, is not the captain, it's Ottilia. And then the D, that's the big question. Are C and D, are Charlotte and the captain going to get together? Well, we'll see.